Hello again. Tonight we begin a new series on taxation. My guests for the next 3 weeks are going to be Charles, or Chuck Davenport, a professor of law at Columbia University, and David, I'm sorry, Columbia University. I got you in the Ivy League. Rutgers
Thank
University.
you. I appreciate that.
Right. And David Millstein, who is the manager of which department?
I'm the tax partner in charge.
Tax partner in charge of
Coopers and Lybrand.
Coopers and Lybrand in Newark, New Jersey.
Yes.
At least I've got you geographically placed in the right area.
Got it.
The purpose of this program is not to help you prepare an income tax return, but rather we want to get into some of the subtleties of tax policy and some of the issues that affects not only taxes but ultimately your pocketbook. Gentlemen, in talking about taxes, we look at, we hear about titles and subjects such as tax shelters. And now, increasingly, recently in the Fort Lee area, as you both know, we had a case where the government clamped down on what they considered an abusive tax shelter. Now, what's happening here in terms of the taxpayer? I know some people have a feeling that there's a lack of equity. There's not really fairness because some people have tax shelters that enable them to lower their tax bills, and yet the government says, well, now wait a minute, this thing can be abused, and one has to be careful about how they use tax write-offs and tax opportunities. Where does the average public stand in terms of opportunities and write-offs and being knowledgeable or lacking knowledge in this area?
Well, if I may start, Phil, I think a tax shelter is an investment that somebody goes into, just like they may buy bonds or buy some real estate. Tax shelter, though, other than some other investments, offers certain tax advantages. Real
but
estate.
Dave, many of us have a tax shelter immediately when we buy a home.
Well, buying a home, sure, the interest deduction, things like that. The abusive tax shelters you're talking about are those shelters which the IRS feels go maybe beyond what is economically sound, and the sole reason for people investing in them concerns the tax benefits, many of which the IRS will question as being legitimate.
But the point I'm really trying to get, and sometimes I have trouble developing my question here on the program. The point I'm trying to get to, I've been impressed with the fact that Congress uses taxation and tax policy as a method of influencing behavior, or uses it as a method to achieve economic ends for what the Congress people, the legislators view as the welfare of the country.
Yes, well, Congress does that on occasion, and frequently you get an over-response. And the consequence of that is in the abusive tax shelter areas, you frequently get people selling things that they're claiming they're making investments, but in fact, they're not making an investment in what the Congress was trying to encourage. They're making an investment in some sort of paper prospectus, or frequently even the investments really don't exist. And that, of course, would be an abusive shelter. Or the price is forced up well beyond what it would sell for in the market simply because of the tax shelter aspects.
Well, Chuck, before joining the law school, the law faculty at Rutgers,
Thank you.
You were with the government, and you were part of the process of tax legislation, I assume.
Yeah, that was several years ago. Yes.
Okay. Now, Dave, I know that in your apprenticeship or in your early days, you served in Washington, and you were close to the legislative process, even though you were with your accounting firm.
That's right. I was down there in the 1976 legislative process, during which a lot of the start of the service analysis, very close analysis of tax shelters began.
Well, let's broaden the discussion beyond tax shelters. On the one hand, you've got the government policy maker. On the other hand, you've got the practitioner or the CPA who should be bringing to the client the opportunities and the areas of investment opportunity. Now, it's strange that this kind of abuse happens in some cases. In a sense, I'm sure a CPA can be obligated or has an obligation to warn and keep a client away from pitfalls. Now, the CPA knows what the rules are, and the IRS and Congress tips him off. Well, am I naive in this kind of probing about the process?
In all honesty, somewhat, I think.
Okay, then
the rules aren't that clear. The Internal Revenue Code has provisions in there, which in some cases are fairly clear. Most cases are not. There are 3 volumes of regulations interpreting the code. There are many cases interpreting the regulations, and still there's
these
uncertainty.
volumes and cases are written by government people, or written by practitioners?
The regulations
like
are written by the Treasury. Okay, case law is just like any other legal matter. It's people get sued, they go to court, whatever. But the certainty in the area is oftentimes lacking. A lot of us who have practiced for a while, as well as in the academic world, have a fairly good feel for what would be allowed, what would not be allowed, but we are oftentimes prognosticating ourselves, and we still don't feel that certain all the time.
The difficulty arises because the rules are written frequently on assumptions that simply aren't stated. And it's always possible for somebody to come along and to erect some sort of an investment that, at least in the minds of people administering the law and frequently courts, that for one reason or another, this kind of investment does not meet those underlying assumptions. And so when the case is then tried in the court will simply say, no, you don't get the benefits, because even though you look like it on paper and it looks like you followed the wording of the code exactly, the underlying assumptions behind that investment simply aren't met.
An interesting, excuse me.
Go ahead.
An interesting factor we have to deal with is that when we are advising our clients today, we are not only looking at what the law is today and what the understanding of the IRS is today, but we think what it will be maybe 2-3 years down the road when the tax return in which this investment shows up will be audited. So we have to be somewhat clairvoyant as to where the IRS is going and what we feel the state of the law will be at such time.
One of the things that really puzzles me, there was just a case in the newspaper the other day. I had always assumed, and I'm a layman in this area, although I work in the area, but I certainly don't have the sensitivity that both of you do. I had always had an assumption that most of these things, once they're put into regulation, are grandfathered, and apparently that's no longer true. That there is not an ongoing protection just because it was codified in the past.
The effective dates of a lot of changes in the law can vary. Talking about legislation, typically the effective date may be when the legislation is enacted. Regulations are more interpretive of what existing law is and was. They may be retroactive. So even though the regulation comes out today, it may cover a transaction which occurred 3-4 years ago, perhaps. Case law is similar. Case law is retroactive. And even though the transaction was prior, it still could be covered by perhaps an unfortunate case decision as far as the taxpayer is concerned.
Yeah, a case decided in court is almost always retroactive because the court is declaring in 1984 what the law was back when this tax return was filed for 1978. The Commissioner of Internal Revenue, who promulgates regulations in concurrence with the Secretary of Treasury, has the opportunity of saying about a regulation, it covers just from the date of publication forward, or it can cover from the time that the law was enacted in the fashion that the regulations are interpreting.
While we're in this area, do either of you have a couple rules of thumb that you can throw out to the average viewer in terms of guidelines or precautions where one does not inadvertently get burned by being overly venturesome?
Well, I think the best rule of thumb I could throw out is only go into a tax shelter or tax-oriented investment if the deal makes sense to you absent the claimed tax benefits. Because those tax benefits...
It's a
right,
good business
sound
proposition.
economic deal, because those tax benefits may or may not be there when the IRS is finished with it. So go into sound economic deals. If the tax benefits are there, that's just gravy to the deal.
And if the tax benefit is removed, you've still got an investment that...
You're still not going to lose your money.
Right.
Okay, you still have something there.
That makes good sense. We'll be back. We'll have both these gentlemen back with us both next week and the week after, and we'll try to develop topics and issues that will enlighten you about tax legislation and help you perhaps make money and certainly avoid embarrassing situations for you. Have a good week. Join me here on the Money Corner again next week.